All right, everybody, welcome back to another video lesson from ICU Advantage. And I do want to welcome you to our fifth and final lesson in this series on arterial blood gases. And in this lesson, we're going to be talking about the Tic Tac Toe method. And I'll explain more in a minute exactly how we do that, but basically this is another real popular method that people use when it comes to interpreting their ABGs. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Eddie Watson, and I'm going to be your presenter for this lesson. And if this is your first time to our channel, we do invite you to subscribe to our channel below. We consistently put out new content related to critical care education, and so if you just hit the subscribe button down below, make sure and hit that bell icon though and select all notifications. This way you'll be notified anytime a new lesson becomes available. Alright, so the Tic Tac Toe method, what exactly is this? So as I said, it's really a popular method that a lot of people use when they're trying to interpret their ABGs and understand what's going on with their patient. Now, this method is a little bit different than what we had talked about in the last two lessons, in which we really broke down the first 4 steps of interpreting an ABG, as well as the follow-on interpretation of if your patient was compensated, fully compensated, not compensated, or partially compensated. And if you haven't watched those, I'll link to those up above here, so make sure and go watch those as well. But essentially the tic-tac-toe method is a different way of doing things and visualizing things that for some people they find to be an easier way of doing this interpretation. The beauty of all this is there's not necessarily one right method in order to do it, and so I always suggest that you learn all the different methods and find what really works best for you and what helps you to understand this and be able to make your own interpretations properly. And so essentially the tic-tac-toe method is going to help you to interpret that ABG as well as be able to determine what kind of compensation your patient has or doesn't have going on. And so the way that this method works is it's really similar to the game of tic-tac-toe that we all used to play as kids. And so if you remember, we had this crisscross board here of lines, and you'd write in your X's and your O's, and you would really work to try to get to where you had 3 in a row. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing with the tic-tac-toe method. Just instead of using X's and O's, we're going to be putting in values based on our ABG. And so what we're going to do is we're going to run through some examples using the tic-tac-toe method and show you this different method using a little bit more visual of a process. And from there, you guys can decide which way really helps you in your own understanding. But before we get started, I do want to hit on a really important key thing that you guys need to know. We've talked about it in the past lessons, but it's really going to become vital in being able to utilize this tic-tac-toe method. And that's going to be, one, to know and memorize what those normal ABG values are. And so I will put those down on the bottom of the screen and again leave these up when we do these examples. But along with that, you also need to make sure that you know and memorize that our CO2 is going to be acidic and that our bicarb is alkaline. Like I said, we've talked about this and covered this enough in the past few lessons that hopefully you guys have this memorized now. And so without knowing these normal ABG values and knowing that CO2 contributes to acidosis and bicarb contributes to alkalosis, you guys are just not going to be able to interpret these ABGs, and you're not going to be able to use this tic-tac-toe method either. So again, I'm just going to stress this. It's really important that you guys memorize this stuff. Alright, so like I said, we're going to go through some examples here to hopefully explain this tic-tac-toe method for you guys. So on the left here is where we're going to list out our example ABG results, and on the right you see what looks like a tic-tac-toe board. This is where we're going to utilize that tic-tac-toe method in order to interpret these ABGs. But the way that we're going to use this board here when we're interpreting these ABGs is every single time up at the very top, we're going to fill in some information and list things as either an acid, being normal, or being a base. This is also what we refer to as alkaline. And so to start out, let me go ahead and put in an example ABG here to begin with. And so for this example, we're going to have a pH of 7.41. We're going to have a PaO2 of 110. We're going to have a PaCO2 of 38, a bicarb of 24, and an oxygen saturation of 98%. So just like in the last two lessons, we're not going to use the PaO2 and the oxygen saturation in order to make a determination on what's going on with our ABG. Again, these values are important to our patient, but for the purpose of this interpretation, we're going to go ahead and ignore these here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our pH. So now you want to look at this and look at our normal values and determine, is this an acid, is this a normal value, or is this a base? So hopefully you have this memorized by now, but if you don't, we'll look down below and we'll see that our pH normal range is 7.35 to 7.45. And so with this value of 7.41, we know that our pH is actually going to be normal. So next, we're going to take a look at our PaCO2. Here again, we have a value of 38. If we consider what our normal value is for the PaCO2, we know it's 35 to 45. And so again, this value of 38 is actually going to be normal. Finally, we're going to take a look at our bicarb, our HCO3. Here we have a value of 24. And again, if we compare that to what our normal value is of 22 to 26, again, we can tell that our bicarb is actually normal as well. And so here's an example where we actually have everything that lines up underneath itself. So just like we did in the days of the X's and the O's, playing that game as a kid, we'll just draw a line straight through here. And because everything here is normal, we know that we have a normal ABG. Nothing about this ABG is outside of the normal range, telling us that this patient is just functioning within the normal range of what we would expect to see on our ABG results. All right, pretty easy example, I know. All right, let's go ahead and move on to another example for you guys here. In this example, we're going to have a pH of 7.25, a PaO2 of 60, a PaCO2 of 59, a bicarb of 25, and an oxygen saturation of 86%. So once again, for the purpose of this interpretation, we are going to ignore these two values here. All right, and so once again, let's go ahead and start with our pH. And so here our value is 7.25. If we compare that to our normal values, 7.35 to 7.45, we can see that this value is actually lower than our normal value, and therefore we know that this pH is actually going to be acidic. So next, we're going to move on to our PaCO2. Here we have a value of 59. Again, if we know our normal values, 35 to 45, then we know that this value is high, but we need to determine, is this an acid or a base? And so like I said, it's important that you know how the CO2 and the bicarb contribute to our pH, because you're going to need to know that here in order to do this interpretation. So like we talked about, the CO2 we know is an acid, and so if our value is high, then we're going to be contributing to a state of acidosis. Therefore, our CO2 will fall in here. So moving on, we'll take a look at our bicarb. And so here we have a value of 25. And again, looking at what our normal value should be, we know we should be in the range of 22 to 26. Therefore, this bicarb is actually going to be within a normal value. All right, so at this point, we have these two values that line up. So we'll draw a line through here. And so at this point, we can do our basic interpretation so far. And so we know we have a state of acidosis, and that's being driven by our CO2, which if you remember from our past lessons, we know that this is a primarily respiratory disturbance. Therefore, at this point, we know that we have a respiratory acidosis. And so now the final step that we need to do is determine what kind of compensation or lack thereof do we have going on. Again, we covered this pretty extensively in part 4 in this series, again, which I'm going to link to up above. But we have to remember that we have those three states of compensation, either uncompensated, fully compensated, or partially compensated. And from that lesson we talked about, in order to be uncompensated, you had to have an abnormal pH with one normal value and one abnormal value when looking at your CO2 and your bicarb. And so if we actually look at this example here, we have an abnormal pH and we have an abnormal CO2 but a normal bicarb. And so this way we know that we have an uncompensated respiratory acidosis. And again, if you just kind of think about what's going on here, we have a respiratory acidosis that's going on, and we are expecting the body to compensate by raising the bicarb to bring that pH back into a normal range. But right now the bicarb's still normal, so none of that compensation is going on, leading us to know that we have an uncompensated state. All right, hopefully you guys were able to follow along with that. And so we're going to go ahead and do another example here. And for this example, we're going to have a pH of 7.49, a PaO2 of 82, a CO2 of 44, a bicarb of 29, and an oxygen saturation of 95%. Once again, we'll ignore these two values here. And let's start off and look at our pH. Well, pH is 7.49. Knowing our normal values, we can tell that this pH is actually a little bit high, a little bit outside that normal range, meaning that we have a state of alkalosis. So next we want to look at our CO2. And so here we know that our value of 44 actually falls within our normal range. Therefore, we know our CO2 is normal. And so next we'll look at our bicarb. Here we have a value of 29. And if we look at our normal values of 22 to 26, we can see that this bicarb is actually high. And so since we know that bicarb contributes to a more alkaline environment, since we have more of it around, we can say that that is the base, or the more alkaline. So once again, we've got our Tic Tac Toe, so we'll draw our line through here. So here we have a state of alkalosis because our pH is high, and the value that's driving that is our bicarb. And so because we know bicarb is a primarily metabolic disturbance, we can then conclude that we have a metabolic alkalosis. So now finally we need to determine what kind of compensation we have going on. And so if we think about the uncompensated state, we have to have an abnormal pH with one abnormal and one normal value. Well, lo and behold, we do have an abnormal pH and an abnormal bicarb and a normal CO2. Therefore, we can determine that this is an uncompensated metabolic alkalosis. Again, we find ourselves in a state of alkalosis because our bicarb is abnormally high, so we would expect the CO2 to raise in response to that to bring that pH back down to a normal range, but the CO2 is still normal, so the body just isn't compensating it. All right, let's go ahead and do some more examples here. For this next one, we're going to have a pH of 7.32, a PaO2 of 95, a PaCO2 of 32, a bicarb of 20, and an oxygen saturation of 97%. Again, let's disregard these here. And so we'll start out looking at our pH. And so here we know that this pH is 7.32 is actually going to be lower than our normal range, meaning that we have a state of acidosis. So next we'll look at our CO2. And here this value of 32 is going to be lower than our normal range. Again, knowing that CO2 is an acid and we have a low amount of that, it's actually going to be contributing to an alkaline environment. And so then we'll look at our bicarb, which our value of 20, again, is low when we look at our normal of 22 to 26. And for this, since we know that bicarb is an alkaline, and the pH and the bicarb go in the same direction, since our bicarb is low, we're going to have a more acidic environment, and our pH is also going to be low, and therefore we know that the bicarb is the acid here. So again, we can make our line through things here. And so in this example, we find ourselves in a state of acidosis, being primarily driven by bicarb, which is a metabolic process. Therefore, we know we have a metabolic acidosis. And so we just need to determine at this point what kind of compensation we have going on. So now when we looked at the uncompensated state, we had to have a abnormal pH, which we do have here, but then we had to have one abnormal value and one normal value. Well, in this case, both our bicarb and our CO2 are abnormal, so we can determine that there's not an uncompensated state. And so the next one we would look at is this a fully compensated ABG? And in order to have a fully compensated ABG, the telltale sign is that you have a normal pH. But like we talked about, our pH is abnormal, therefore we know it's not a compensated ABG either. And so that really brings us to our last state of compensation, which is a partially compensated ABG. For that, we have to have an abnormal pH and two abnormal matching values. And so if you think about that, our bicarb is low at 20, but our CO2 is also low at 32. So these values are both abnormal and matching. They're both low, and we have an abnormal pH. So we can tell that this is a partially compensated metabolic acidosis. And so again, if we think about what's going on here, we have a state of acidosis caused by a low bicarb. In order to compensate, we expect the body to lower the CO2, helping to raise the pH to get things back into a normal value. And we do see that going on here. So the body is attempting to compensate. It's lowering that CO2 in response to this, but it just hasn't raised the pH enough to get it back into that normal range. Therefore, we can only say that this is partially compensated. Hopefully that explanation makes sense for you guys. Like I said, when we talk about these compensation mechanisms, this is where people tend to get the most hung up on them. But really, if you just go through and practice these over and over and think about what's happening, take your time with it, trust me, you can get this figured out. All right, let's go ahead and do another example for you guys. Here we're going to have a pH of 7.29, a PaO2 of 85, a PaCO2 of 51, a bicarb of 27, and an oxygen saturation of 94%. Again, we'll disregard these here and start out looking at our pH of 7.29. So once again, we know that this pH is low compared to our normal values, therefore we have a state of acidosis. And so next, if we look at our CO2, so here we have a CO2 of 51, which we know is going to be high. We know CO2 is an acid, therefore this CO2 value is going to be contributing to an acid. And then next we'll look at our bicarb of 27. So here we can see this bicarb is also high when compared to our normal range of 22 to 26, but because we know bicarb is a base or an alkaline, we know that that is contributing over here. So once again, we can draw our line here, and based on this state of acidosis being driven by CO2, we can determine that this is a respiratory acidosis. And so finally, we just need to determine what kind of compensation we have going on. Well, we have an abnormal pH, so we know this isn't a compensated ABG. And so looking at our CO2 and our bicarb, we have two abnormal values, both of which are high. Therefore, we have two abnormal matching values in the presence of an abnormal pH. Therefore, we know the body is attempting to compensate for the CO2 by elevating the bicarb in order to bring that pH back into a normal range, but it just hasn't happened yet, and so therefore this is a partially compensated respiratory acidosis. Alright, so let's go ahead and do one last example to hopefully help drive this tic-tac-toe method home for you guys and have you guys really understanding how to do this. So for this final example, we're going to have a pH of 7.44. a PaO2 of 100, a PaCO2 of 30, a bicarb of 20, and an oxygen saturation of 97%. Again, we'll ignore these two values here, and we'll start out looking at our pH. Well, here our value of 7.44 we see actually falls within the normal range. And so we'll go on and look at our PaCO2. So here we can see our CO2 is low, and therefore a low CO2 would actually be an alkaline state, so we can put that over here. And so next we'll look at our bicarb, which is 20. Well, here the bicarb is also low as well, and we know that since bicarb's an alkaline, having less of it around is going to contribute to a state of acidosis. Well, at this point, based on what we've put in here, we can't draw our line down and determine what's going on here. And so like I talked about, what you're going to have to do is look at this pH value, and if we remember about compensation, that compensation is never going to fully normalize. So we know this pH is on the higher end of the normal of what we would expect our pH to be. Therefore, at one point we had a high pH that has been brought back down into a normal range. Therefore, we know we used to have a state of alkalosis. And since we know the CO2 is the one contributing to that state of alkalosis, then we can determine that we have a respiratory alkalosis. Finally, we just need to determine what kind of compensation we have going on. And if you remember when we were talking about those three different types of compensation, the one key telltale sign that we have a compensated ABG is that we have a normal pH. And since we know we have a CO2 that was contributing to a state of alkalosis, the body compensated by lowering our bicarb in order to bring that pH back into the normal range. And because we got back into that normal range, we can now say that this is a compensated respiratory alkalosis. Alright, you guys, well, I hope the explanation of this tic-tac-toe method and going through these examples helped to have this make sense for you guys. Like I said, this is just one method and a whole slew of different methods that you guys can use in order to interpret these ABGs. And the important thing is that you find something that works for you, that helps you to be able to see how to do this interpretation and come up with the right answer. And at the end of the day, whatever method you're using, as long as you're getting to the final correct conclusion, that's really what matters for your patient. And so with that said, that's really going to conclude this lesson as well as this series on arterial blood gases. I truly want to thank you guys for watching and following along. I really hope that you guys found these lessons to be useful. If you did, make sure and go down and hit the like button below. It really does help to spread the word about our channel, and we absolutely appreciate it. As well, in the comments, feel free to leave us a comment on what you thought about this lesson, as well as any questions that you might have. And finally, since this series is over, make sure and check out some of our other great lessons that we have on hemodynamics and shock. And as always, we thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.